Thank you for joining us as we explore one of the most unsettling instances in American history. We'll explore the foggy Appalachian Mountains today, where a bride vanished from both official records and life, and where the wind carries old secrets. Please leave a comment indicating your location if you're watching from anywhere in the world. We continue to pursue the truth because of this connection. North Carolina's Asheville, a town surrounded by foggy mountains, where old trees whisper tales that no one else is willing to share. This location served as a transit hub for traders, a haven for families looking for a new beginning, and a stage for mysteries that defied reason in 1856. Through the thick forest, dirt roads connected remote villages where people believed they knew one another. Nina Whitmore came to town in this environment. One afternoon in October, she arrived from Richmond, Virginia with just a birth certificate and a battered leather suitcase, confirming that she is 23 years old. Nina's eyes were clear and appeared to reflect light in an odd, almost spectral manner. Even though her navy blue dress was dusty from the lengthy carriage ride, she remained dignified and upright, as though she had a secret mission. Thomas Hartwell, a lumber merchant who had promised marriage via mail, was the man she was looking for. Their 6-month correspondence depicted a bright future, a home by the French Broad River, and a straightforward but safe life away from the Richmond's social forces. In the neighborhood, Thomas was regarded as a serious, industrious man. Nina thought she was making the right decision by leaving behind a past she never spoke about in detail. Something changed when she eventually met Thomas at the Central Inn in Asheville. The two had a brief, almost icy conversation, according to witnesses. Thomas looked uneasy, looking away all the time. Nina kept up a fake smile, as though she was trying to reassure herself that everything was fine. They decided to get married in a modest ceremony at the neighborhood Baptist church the next morning. Just the required witnesses and a formal registration at the Buncombe County Courthouse, no lavish celebration. However, something unexpected happened the next morning. Nina, wearing a plain white dress that she had sewn herself, arrived at the church on time. But Thomas and 2 men no one in town knew showed up nearly an hour late. The ceremony was swiftly led by Reverend Josiah Mills, without the ornate blessings and the customary vows. In less than 15 minutes, everything was completed. With shaking hands and nearly unreadable handwriting, Nina signed the marriage register before something remarkable occurred. Or, more accurately, it never happened. Nina's signed document was never delivered to the official registry office. Authorities checked weeks after Reverend Mills claimed to have personally delivered the documents to the responsible clear, but they found no evidence of a marriage between Thomas Hartwell and Eleanor Whitmore. That ceremony seemed to have never happened. Eleanor was scarcely visible in the city during the next few days, when the shadows grew longer and the cold started to bite. Locals said they saw her walking by herself along the paths that led to the higher mountains. She appeared to be either fleeing from something or searching for something. Nobody knew for sure. For his part, Thomas started to withdraw more and more. He isolated himself on his land and declined to guests. He would merely reiterate that Nina had left and returned to Virginia, but that neither a carriage nor a stagecoach had documented her departure when questioned about her whereabouts. Her name was not used to purchase any tickets. Eleanor Whitmore just vanished from Asheville's collective memory and official records. Whispers spread throughout the town. According to some voices, brides who dared to defy their predetermined destinies were plagued by an old curse. Others brought up native myths regarding the female spirits that lived in the mountains, luring visitors into a never-ending slumber amid the foliage. The most disturbing theory, however, was put forth by Sarah Drummond, a washerwoman who claimed to have seen Ellelanina speaking to shadows devoid of human form on a new moon night along the banks of the French Broad River. What was Ellelanina Whitmore's true fate? For what reason was her marriage removed from the books? And who were the two unidentified men who went to the ceremony with Thomas? The solutions would start to show up in bits and pieces, similar to a macabre puzzle that nobody desired to put together. This would remain a secret in Asheville for decades, until long-forgotten records in a dusty basement exposed a reality more sinister than any local folklore could conjure. Asheville experienced an odd atmosphere in the months after Eleanor vanished. The city, used to its steady rhythms, started to feel the weight of an unexplainable force. Earlier, store owners shut down. At dusk, families avoided going for walks by themselves, and Ellelanina Whitmore's name became A. Conversations in the central square are prohibited to whisper. Thomas Hartwell carried on working with wood as usual, but something had changed about him. His eyes were vacant, and his movements were robotic. The workers at his sawmill discussed odd behaviors with one another. Frequently, Thomas would pause in the middle of a task to gaze intently at the mountains, as though he thought someone would appear out of the mist. He started drinking a lot in 1857, which was strange for a man who had previously been recognized for his moderation. One interesting detail was revealed by Martha Kenley, the owner of the boarding house where Ellelanina had spent her first night in Asheville. Weeks after Ellelanina's departure, Martha was cleaning the room when she discovered a small, brown, leather-bound diary concealed behind a loose board. The pages included notes from the days leading up to the wedding, written in a hasty handwriting style. Ellelanina wrote about her anxieties and the visions that plagued her while traveling from Richmond. One entry in particular caught my attention. Ellelanina reported that 2 days prior to her departure from Virginia, she received an anonymous letter cautioning her against proceeding with the marriage. The letter mentioned other women who had vanished in the Appalachian region under comparable circumstances, all of which involved mail-order arranged marriages. Using a postage stamp from Knoxville, Tennessee, a city west of Asheville, the sender did not reveal their identity. Martha brought the journal to Cornelius Wade, the local sheriff, a middle-aged man with a reputation for being methodical and cautious. Wade looked more and more closely at the document. He saw that Ellelanina had noted the names of Samuel Crow and Nathaniel Voss, two unidentified men who had accompanied Thomas to the ceremony. Although no one in Asheville had heard of these names, a look through the lodging records showed that both had stayed at an inn close to the Tennessee border. Sheriff Wade made the decision to look into the matter further after arriving just 1 day prior to the wedding. He went to Knoxville in February 1857, enduring the bitter cold of the mountains and muddy roads. When he spoke with the local authorities there, he found something unsettling. At least 4 women have vanished in the past 5 years after relocating to Appalachian small towns to wed men they had corresponded with. They were all connected in some way. They had no close relatives, were from bigger cities, and vanished a few weeks after the alleged wedding. The pattern was uncannily similar. In every instance, the union was carried out swiftly with few witnesses, and the official records either vanished or had contradictions. None of the women were ever seen by acquaintances or distant relatives again, despite the groom's later claims that they had left voluntarily and returned to their places of origin. Wade came back to Asheville with a somber theory in his head. He had a sneaking suspicion that he was dealing with something more significant than a straightforward disappearance, something planned and intentional. However, proving anything would be very challenging. The men involved were careful not to leave any obvious evidence, and there were no bodies or trustworthy witnesses. The lumber merchant stuck to his story when he confronted Thomas Hartwell again with more reliable information. Eleanor had simply gone, but his hands were obviously perspiring and his voice shook as he spoke. Without hard evidence, Wade came to the conclusion that Thomas knew more than he acknowledged. He couldn't make him confess or put him under arrest. The inquiry appeared to have come to a standstill until the sheriff received an unexpected revelation from Sarah Drummond, the lairess who said she saw Eleanor on the riverbank. That night, Sarah admitted, she had seen more than just shadows. On the higher slopes, where flocks of black crows always circled, she saw Eleanor being led by 3 men toward an abandoned cabin, which the locals called Crow Point. At first, Sarah had lied because she was afraid, but now she was feeling guilty. She outlined the men in great detail. One was unmistakably Thomas, the other was tall and slender, dressed in a dark overcoat, and the third was sturdy and had a thick beard. Nathaniel Voss and Samuel Crow fit the descriptions exactly. An expedition was planned to Crow Point by Sheriff Wade. The higher trails were still partially covered by snow in March 1857. There was the cabin Sarah had described, half hidden by thick pines. The building was in ruins, its roof barely holding up and its boards rotting. Investigators discovered evidence of recent habitation inside. Something that chilled WDE's blood, rope marks on the wooden beams, and cold ashes in a makeshift fireplace. Pieces of navy blue fabric that matched Eleanina's Asheville arrival dress. However, there was no further evidence or indication of what might have happened next. Like the surrounding mountains, the cabin was as obstinate in keeping its secrets. The investigation's path was entirely altered by the discovery at Crow Point. Sheriff Wade was confident that he now had sufficient proof to put pressure on Thomas Hartwell and track down the other 2 men, but he didn't realize how difficult the task would be. Not long after their wedding, Samuel Crow and Nathaniel Voss had vanished from the area, and no one knew for sure where they were. Wade made the decision to take a different approach. Rather than face Thomas head-on, he started looking into his past, looking for clues that would explain why he was involved in that sinister scheme, what he found to be unsettling. Asheville was not Thomas's birthplace. He had traveled from the small eastern Tennessee town of Greenville to the city in 1854. He kept in touch with a small group of people while working as a carpenter there. Wade discovered something instructive in the Greenville Baptist Church's records. Prior to this, in 1853, Thomas was married to Abigail Morse. She had also arrived via correspondence marriage from Charleston, South Carolina. The union lasted just 3 years. Months prior, Abigail allegedly claimed she couldn't adjust to life in the mountains and left to go back to her hometown. However, Abigail never made it to Charleston, just like Eleanor. She never heard from her distant relatives again. The pattern was getting too obvious to be a coincidence. Quaid came to the realization that he was dealing with a systematic operation that probably involved several people and spanned several counties. Lonely men used romantic letters, marriage promises, and other means to entice women without close family ties. Safety. However, shortly after the ceremony, a sinister event occurred. Wade got an unexpected letter in April of 1857. Henry Blackwood, a deputy from Jonesboro, Tennessee, was the sender. Blackwood recognized similarities to a disappearance he had looked into 2 years prior, after reading about Eleanina's case in the local newspapers. Lydia Fairchild had come to Jonesboro from Raleigh, North Carolina, to wed a blacksmith. Weeks later, she vanished, and the blacksmith said she had fled, off with a different man. Blackwood found no evidence to contradict this version, but he never trusted it. The 2 investigators made the decision to work together. They started mapping a network of disappearances that spanned the Appalachian region through correspondence and reciprocal visits. They found that the chilling pattern was present in at least 7 of the cases over the previous 8 years. Distance-traveling women, hurried marriages, lost or inaccurate records, and unexplained disappearances. What interested Wade and the marriage records were the most pressing issue for Blackwood. What was causing the documents to vanish? Who was interested in removing them and who had access to them? The source of the answer was unexpected. A former Buncombe Registry Office clerk who retired in 1856, the year Ellelanina vanished. Wade was approached on a soggy May afternoon by a man named Ezra Peaton. Ezra was holding a yellowed envelope with trembling hands, clearly nervous. He acknowledged that he had taken bribes for years in order to. Marriage certificates vanish. Ezra only knew the lawyer from Knoxville as the middleman who always handled the money. He just accepted the payment and took the documents out of the official files without inquiring about the motivation. Wade received the envelope that Ezra had held onto for so long. Copies of 3 marriage documents he had deleted, including those of Thomas Hartwell and Ellelanina Whitmore, were found inside. However, there was more. Notes by hand in the margins of the records, dates that didn't match the marriages, and numbers that appeared to be dollar amounts. Wade became aware that he was looking at a record of financial transactions, some sort of accounting. It was a startling discovery. The marriages were a part of a bigger financial scheme rather than the ultimate objective. Wade started to think of a theory. Promises of marriage were used to entice the women. Additionally, something occurred following the ceremonies that made it possible for the men to benefit in some way. However, how? What about these women was so valuable that it warranted such a complex and risky procedure? As Wade dug deeper into Thomas Hartwell's financial background, the solution started to take shape. He learned that Thomas had deposited $800, a substantial amount at the time, at the local bank soon after Ellelanina vanished. Thomas stated that the money came from the sale of lumber when asked where it came from, but the company records did not support this claim. This tale. Wade also learned that Nathaniel Voss and Samuel Crow were well known in Knoxville's criminal community. Voss was suspected of participating in document forgery schemes, while Crow had a history of property and inheritance fraud. Both were associated with a law firm that dealt with wills and inheritance. This is precisely the kind of company that might profit from identity theft or civil record manipulation. The last puzzle piece was starting to fit together. The women weren't picked at random. They were picked because they had land rights, bank accounts, insurance policies, inherited property, or something of value. The women simply vanished, unable to challenge the transfers, and the men legally took possession of these assets after the marriages. Wade was still plagued by a terrible question, though. After all, what actually became of these women? Their bodies were where? Why had no tangible proof of their fates ever been discovered? The Appalachian Mountains are enormous and harsh, able to conceal secrets for many generations. And maybe that was exactly the plan. With the financial connections mapped out and Ezra Pemberton's revelations, Sheriff Wade knew he had to move fast. The plot was more extensive and intricate than any previous crime he had encountered. A criminal network that operated across state lines, taking advantage of weaknesses in registration systems and the vulnerability of women looking for a new beginning, was responsible for more than just a few isolated disappearances. June of 1857. Deputy Blackwood went with Wade to Knoxville. They had to figure out who the enigmatic lawyer Ezra had mentioned was, and how the operation was run behind the scenes. Compared to Asheville, Knoxville was a bigger city with a bustling business district. The Knox County Courthouse was close to a red brick building that housed the law office that handled wills and inheritances. Harlan Pritchard, the lead lawyer, was well liked in the neighborhood and renowned for his thorough, deal with estate-related issues. Pritchard was a formidable heir to power, about 50 years old, with gray hair combed back. Without hard proof, Wade and Blackwood couldn't just break into his office. They therefore made the discreet decision to map his visitors and routines. They watched Pritchard from a distance for 2 weeks. The attorney maintained a regular routine. He met with clients during the day, came to work in the morning, and frequently ate at a classy restaurant close to the river Tennessee. However, there was a strange quality to his Thursdays. Pritchard had always left the office at noon on that day and walked to a less respectable tavern on the outskirts of town, a haunt of shady merchants and gamblers. On a sweltering July afternoon, Wade and Blackwood eventually found the connection they were seeking there. They watched as Samuel Crow and Pritchard met at a private table in the rear of the tavern. The discussion went on for nearly an hour, and even though they couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was clear that the two men were exchanging envelopes. After putting the envelope in his coat's inside pocket, Crow went out the back door and vanished into the winding streets. Wade was aware that in order to construct a case against Pritchard, he needed more solid evidence. He required written proof that linked the attorney to the disappearances. He secured a limited search warrant in Knoxville with the assistance of a sympathetic judge to look through the public documents Pritchard maintained, pertaining to inheritance cases that have been handled recently. What they discovered was illuminating. Many property transfers involving newlyweds who were subsequently found to have abandoned their homes had been handled by Pritchard. In each instance, the husbands produced documentation stating that their wives had voluntarily left, giving up their claim to assets and property. Pritchard made these statements to enable the lawful transfer of assets to the husbands, who then sold or gave them to other people, always in return for the attorney receiving a sizable commission. The sums were astounding. Pritchard had facilitated transfers totaling over $15,000 over the previous 5 years, which was a significant fortune at the time. Additionally, one of the disappearances that Wade and Blackwood mapped temporarily corresponded with each of these transfers. When they looked closely at Elelanina Whitmore's case, the most unsettling finding was made. Elelanina had inherited a modest estate from a distant aunt prior to departing Richmond, a piece of property with a modest home that is worth about $1,200. Perceiving this inheritance as her contribution to the new house they would construct together, she had brought it up in her correspondence with Thomas. Elelanina sold the property to Thomas Hartwell for $500, which was significantly less than market value, according to documents presented in the Richmond court just 3 weeks after she vanished. Eleanor's signature appeared on the sales document, but Wade later consulted handwriting experts who noted important discrepancies in comparison to real samples from the boarding house diary. Nathaniel Voss, the master of fake documents, had probably forged the signature. At last, Wade had a strong case. William Stanton, the district attorney for Knoxville, was an honorable man to whom he presented his findings. The scope of the plan astounded Stanton, who decided to call a grand jury to formally look into Harland Pritchard, Nathaniel Voss, Thomas Hartwell, and Samuel Crow. However, prior to formal charges being filed, an unforeseen circumstance occurred. Thomas Hartwell was discovered in severe distress on his Asheville property in August of 1857. The night before, neighbors said they heard screams coming from his house. When Sheriff Wade got there, he discovered Thomas sitting on his living room floor, muttering nonsensical words while staring blankly into space. It was obvious that Thomas was having a mental breakdown. His repeated use of Elelanina's name, punctuated by entreaties for "Pardon?" Wade attempted to interrogate him, but Thomas vacillated between periods of clarity and complete bewilderment. He started revealing bits and pieces of what had really happened when he was more coherent, but he always stopped short of finishing his confessions, as though something stopped him. After examining Thomas, a local physician identified a serious neurological disorder that may have been brought on by ongoing stress and guilt. He was brought to a facility in Charlotte, North Carolina, so that he could get the care he needed. However, before, only truth lies where crows rest. Thomas handed Wade a rusty key as he left, and Wade instantly understood what he meant. Raven's Point. They had not discovered anything during their initial search, but there was more to that deserted cabin. The key belonged to a secret compartment or chest that held the true secrets. Wade made the decision to go back to that gloomy location in the mountains, but this time he would bring along a bigger crew and the right equipment for a comprehensive search. Whatever was concealed there could ultimately disclose Alelenina's and the other women's fates. Early in September of 1857, the second expedition to Crow Point was planned. 6 reliable men, including Deputy Blackwood, who had come specifically from Jonesboro to take part in the search, were assembled by Sheriff Wade. They prepared for a comprehensive exploration of that remote region in the mountains by bringing lanterns, digging equipment, and ropes. This time, the route to the deserted cabin appeared even more ominous. A thick canopy was created by the trees. That obscured the sun, and the only sound to break the stillness was the distant crows that gave the area its name. Wade felt a burden in his chest as they arrived at the demolished building, a feeling that they were going to find something that would completely alter their life. The key that Thomas had given her was small and outdated, similar to those found on pantry or chest door locks. The men started systematically looking for any building that was locked. One of the assistants noticed something odd about one of the cabin's floorboards. When walked on, it sounded hollow. A compartment carved into the floor, guarded by a solid wooden lid with a rusty padlock, was exposed as they carefully removed the decaying wood. Thomas had the ideal key. Wade's hand shook a little as he opened the compartment. A metal box, roughly the size of a small toolbox, was inside. Despite the dirt and rust covering the surface, the seal remained intact. Using the filtered light that came through the crevices in the surface, he carefully raised it and opened it. Cabin. The simplicity of the contents was unnerving. Dozens of meticulously arranged documents, shielded from moisture by waxed cloth wrappers. Personal letters, property deeds, insurance policies, and birth certificates were all present. A different woman owned each set. There were numerous documents, but Wade recognized Alelenina Whitmore's right away. Lydia Fairchild, Abigail Morse, and 5 other women whose names he had not yet learned, in addition to the private records. Were careful accounting documents in the exact handwriting that Wade recognized from the files of Harlan Pritchard. These ledgers contained names, dates, and values in code. Wade was able to figure out the system after some effort. Every woman was assigned a number, and the values of her assets both before and after the transactions were noted next to it. The money was split among several participants, with Harlan Pritchard, an HP SAC, consistently receiving the highest percentage. However, the most. A notebook bound in black leather was one of the box's unsettling contents. Handwritten descriptions of how each woman had been seduced, married, and then barred from challenging the property transfers were contained within. The tone was clinical and icy, as though discussing routine business dealings. Only notes indicating that the women had been eliminated from consideration or neutralized as a problem were included, with no specific reference to their eventual fate. As Wade read those pages, he felt sick. He had evidence in his hands of a deliberate and brutal criminal enterprise that viewed human lives as nothing more than barriers to financial gain. However, the most crucial question still had an answer. Now, where were these women? Delegate Blackwood noticed something the others had overlooked as he took a closer look at the compartment. Marks were carved into the compacted earth on the inside wall of the hole that had been dug out. They all pointed downward and in the same direction, resembling crude arrows. There was something else buried there. Using shovels they started digging with improvised tools. There were old roots and stones in the hard soil. One of the shovels struck something solid that wasn't stone after about 0.5 meters of digging. It was smooth, made of wood, and functional. They cleared away more dirt surrounding it, exposing what looked like a horizontal wooden cover, similar to the entrance to a basement or underground cellar. Wade gave the order to exercise caution. They discovered rusty hinges and an iron ring to pull after thoroughly cleaning the area around the building. Together, they were able to lift the heavy lid, exposing a rough stairway that led down into the shadows. The air that came out smelled of old mold and damp earth, and it was heavy and cold. Wade went down first, lighting lanterns, followed by Blackwood and 2 other men. The roughly 10-step staircase led to a room that was excavated into the ground and had wooden planks for walls. They had to stoop because of the low ceiling. The area, which was roughly 3 meters long by 2 meters wide, was obviously purposefully built. The room. The walls were worn. There was nothing but dark stains on the earthen floor, rope marks on the wooden supports, and bits of rotting cloth in the corners. There were no human remains and no concrete proof of what had occurred there. Most likely, after every use, the chamber had been thoroughly cleaned. But the fact that that underground prison existed was enough evidence of evil intent. Wade pictured Alelena and the other women being detained there, scared and alone, while their possessions were moved, and their records were fabricated. It was unclear what would happen next, but everything seemed so planned and systematic that it suggested a fate he didn't want to think about in detail. When Wade came back to the surface, he gave the order to record and take pictures of everything. In order to create visual evidence that could be used in court, a traveling photographer in Asheville was hired to capture the scene. After being carefully packed, the documents from the metal box were transferred to WDE's direct custody. Having this proof, he was aware that he had what he needed to bring justice at last. However, he was also aware of how challenging the legal battle would be. Harlan Pritchard had strong connections and was a significant figure. Given their slippery nature, Samuel Crowe and Nathaniel Voss would likely be making plans to leave as soon as they learned how far along the investigation was. Thomas Hartwell might never recover enough sanity to testify because he was confined to an institution. The truth had come to light, but getting convictions would be a whole other story. Moreover, above all, the Appalachian Mountains appeared committed to keeping the ultimate fate of the missing women a secret for as long as possible. One of the most intricate criminal investigations ever carried out in the Appalachian region began when WDS returned to Asheville with the evidence. Now that he was convinced of the case's seriousness, Prosecutor William Stanton rallied resources from North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. The scope of the plan required previously unheard-of collaboration between jurisdictions that hardly ever collaborated. Arrest warrants for Nathaniel Voss, Samuel Crowe, and Harlan Pritchard were issued concurrently in October 1857. In order to reduce the likelihood of escape, the operation was scheduled for dawn. Pritchard was discovered at his home in Knoxville, a stately 2-story home with well-kept grounds. He greeted the officers with unsettling composure, as though he had anticipated this. He put on his finest suit, set up his personal documents, and moved forward without opposition. The same poise was not shown by Samuel Crowe. He was found in a Bristol boarding house on the Tennessee-Virginia border, obviously getting ready to depart. He attempted to flee through the back window when the officers knocked on the door, but after a quick pursuit through the muddy streets, he was apprehended. False documents with various identities and a sizable sum of money were discovered in his room. bills totaling over $1,500 from different banks. Nathaniel Voss demonstrated, be the hardest to find out of the three. He had vanished entirely, departing Knoxville weeks prior, seemingly aware of the investigation's advancement. Wade sent out circulars to every sheriff's office and police precinct from Georgia to Pennsylvania, but Voss appeared to have disappeared. Because of his proficiency with forgery, he was probably able to travel under several identities, making his capture very challenging. The trial of Samuel Crowe and Harlan Pritchard was set for January 1858 in Knoxville, selected due to the jurisdiction's abundance of documentary evidence. Newspapers from different cities sent correspondents to cover the case, which was already being referred to as the Appalachian bride scandal, garnering regional attention. Two seasoned Nashville attorneys who were renowned for their ability to raise reasonable doubt handled Pritchard's defense. From the beginning, their plan was obvious. Recognize that Pritchard had assisted in the transfer of property, but assert that everything was lawful based on the records he thought to be genuine. The defense contended that there was only circumstantial evidence and conjecture regarding the women's disappearances and no evidence of a crime. In contrast, Samuel Crowe said nothing during the first few proceedings. His attorney, a young, inexperienced lawyer appointed by the court, simply reiterated that his client denied any involvement in criminal activity and that his attendance at the weddings was accidental. Stanton, the prosecutor, methodically constructed his case. He displayed the paperwork, discovered in the metal box, demonstrating a blatant conspiracy and fraud pattern. Experts in handwriting provided testimony regarding the signature forgeries. Pritchard was identified as the source of the payments when the former clear, Ezra Peaton, publicly admitted to his involvement in deleting marriage records in return for bribes. Before the wedding, Martha Kenley testified about Elelena's emotional state and brought her diary. Sarah Drummond identified the three men and described what she saw on the river that evening. There was a stir in the courtroom when the photographer showed pictures of the underground chamber and the cabin at Crow Point. However, the moment they called Thomas Hartwell as a witness was the most dramatic. While receiving medical attention, he had made some progress, but his emotional instability persisted. Thomas admitted his involvement in the plot, his voice shaking and pausing often. He described how Samuel Crowe was used by Pritchard to recruit him, at first drawn in by the prospect of simple funds to settle debts related to gambling. Thomas explained how the procedure was carried out. He wrote romantic letters to lonely women in far-off cities, especially those whose newspaper ads claimed to be inheritors or property owners. He invited them to marry after they had started communicating, making sure they came by themselves and without telling many people. Following the rituals, the women were transported to Ravens Point under false pretenses, held in the subterranean room while their paperwork was falsified and their assets were transferred. After the transfers were finished, Thomas started to respond, but his voice failed him, and the courtroom fell into complete silence as the judge asked, "What happened to these women?" His face was wet with tears. He repeatedly opened his mouth to try to speak, but nothing came out. At last, he passed out and was carried out of the room in a collapsed state. That unsolved question loomed like a black cloud over the courtroom. Although everyone was aware of the implication, there was no clear. The prosecutor was unable to formally charge the defendants with murder in the absence of a confession or the finding of human remains. Fraud, conspiracy, forgery, and kidnapping continued to be the main charges. The defense contended that there was no evidence that any woman had been murdered in the absence of bodies, first-hand accounts of violence, or a complete confession. They could have started new lives under different names, been released in isolated places, or experienced any other non-fatal outcome. Technically, it was a morally reprehensible, but a valid argument. For 3 full days, the jury deliberated. When they returned in February 1858 with the verdict, the courtroom was crowded. The convictions of Harlan Pritchard included forgery, conspiracy to commit fraud, and aiding and abetting kidnapping. Samuel Crowe was given a similar sentence that included an attempt to elude justice. The sentences were lengthy. Pritchard was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Crowe was given 15, but he was not found guilty of murder. From a legal perspective, Eleanina Whitmore. And the other women were not dead. They were still missing. Wade and many others felt that full justice had not been served as a result of the bitter legal victory. Although the fact that those responsible had been punished brought some comfort to the victims' estranged families. The absence of clear closure regarding their relatives' fate would haunt them for years to come. Asheville and the surrounding communities saw substantial changes in the years after the trial. The missing brides case had a profound impact on the area, changing people's perceptions of mail-order marriages and their level of trust in strangers. Authorities started conducting more thorough checks on marriage records, and local newspapers published a number of articles cautioning women about the risks of accepting proposals from unidentified men. Thomas Hartwell's recovery was never complete. He remained in the Charlotte institution for the remainder of his life, alternating between periods of profound melancholy and periods of lucidity. In his, he expressed regret in sporadic letters to Sheriff Wade, but he never finished the confession he had started in court. He passed away in 1863, taking with him the last information that would have allowed the families of the victims to find peace. Tennessee State Penitentiary was where Harlan Pritchard completed his sentence. Keeping his haughtiness intact, he continued to correspond with legal colleagues on a regular basis, consistently denying any wrongdoing and asserting that he was only an ignorant middleman when he was set free After 20 years, he was a broken and elderly man in 1878, and everyone who knew his story avoided him. He passed away in 1882 after relocating to a small Kentucky town where he spent his final years in obscurity. After serving 12 years, Samuel Crowe was released in 1870 due to his good behavior. In contrast to Pritchard, Crowe vanished entirely after being released from prison. Though nothing was ever verified, there were sporadic rumors that he was in various states and constantly involved in small-scale fraud schemes. His name was whispered in warning, and he turned into a kind of ghost. Stories. The only one who managed to elude punishment, Nathaniel Voss, was still at large. Unverified rumors of Wade's presence spread over the years, ranging from Michigan to Louisiana. However, the suspect had fled every time local authorities looked into the matter. A man posing as Voss was reportedly spotted in 1869 in San Francisco, California, working as an immigration office clerk under a false identity. However, no one fit the description when investigators showed up. Crow Point developed into a location that the locals avoid. Even decades after the authorities formally sealed off the cabin in 1858 and filled the underground chamber with rocks and dirt, locals still expressed uneasiness when they passed by the location. That trail was avoided by hunters, and parents cautioned their kids not to go out into the mountains by themselves. Wade remained Asheville's sheriff until he made the decision to retire in 1865. He was profoundly impacted by the missing brides case, and he committed a lot of his leisure time in the years that followed to attempt to unravel the ultimate mystery. Eleanina and the other women, where were they? In order to find caves or natural burial sites, he conducted several searches in the Crow Point area, looked through old maps, and spoke with anyone who might have information. Wade's research was revived in 1872 after he received an anonymous letter. The sender claimed to know the fate of the women and described himself only as a repentant man. The letter gave Wade instructions to search in a specific place, a deep ravine about 5 kilometers north of Crow Point, known locally as Echo Gorge, because of the peculiar sound the wind made as it passed through it. Even at 62, Wade was unwavering in his resolve and planned an expedition to the aforementioned site. The Echo Gorge was a crevice in the rock that dropped abruptly for almost 30 meters with steep walls covered in dense vegetation. It was a dangerous place, rarely visited and perfect for hiding secrets that should not be discovered. Using ropes and appropriate equipment, a team carefully descended to the bottom of the ravine. What they found was both revealing and insufficient. There were remnants of personal items scattered among the rocks. A partially preserved wooden comb, fragments of fabric that could have been worn, rusty metal buttons, and pieces of leather that appeared to have come from suitcases or bags. But there was nothing conclusive, nothing that could definitively confirm that this was the final resting place of the missing women. Years, and the elements had deteriorated any organic evidence, and nature had reclaimed the space, covering it with layers of fallen leaves, branches, and new growth. Wade collected the objects found, meticulously documented everything, but knew that even this discovery wouldn't bring the complete closure the families deserved. The anonymous letter was never traced back to its author. Wade suspected it might have been from Nathaniel Voss, perhaps seeking some form of redemption in his final years, or possibly from someone who had served as an occasional helper in the scheme and carried the weight of guilt, but this remained mere speculation. The objects found in Echo Gorge were catalogued and stored in the Buncombe County Archives. The wooden comb was identified by a distant cousin of Lydia Fairchild as similar to one she owned. One of the metal buttons matched the description of a set Elelonena had mentioned in her diary as part of her traveling dress. These were tenuous connections, but enough for Wade to believe he had finally found where the story ended for those women. In 1875, Wade erected a small, unassuming memorial near the entrance to Echo Gorge. It was a simple stone plaque with an inscription in memory of those who journeyed seeking hope and found only silence, never forgotten. He didn't include names, as he wasn't entirely certain, but the gesture brought some comfort to the few families still searching for answers. Sheriff Wade died in 1879 at the age of 69, having dedicated a significant portion of his life to seeking justice for Elelonena, Whitmore, and the other victims of the shadowy scheme that haunted Appalachia. His successor inherited the case files, but with the main culprits already punished or missing, the investigation was officially considered closed. Although technically it remained unsolved, the legacy of the case extended far beyond the lives of those directly involved. As the decades passed, the story of Elelonena Whitmore and the other missing women transformed into something larger than the documented facts, becoming part of the dark folklore of the Appalachians. But behind the legends that would emerge, an important historical truth remained about vulnerability, exploitation, and the failures of the systems that should protect the most vulnerable. In 1889, a journalist named Rebecca Thornton from Charleston visited Asheville while researching forgotten stories of the American South. She discovered the Wade case files in the Buncombe County records and became fascinated by the complexity and systematic nature of the scheme. Rebecca spent 3 months interviewing survivors from that time, collecting documents and reconstructing the complete narrative. Her work resulted in a series of articles published in the Charleston Mercury that brought renewed attention to the case. Rebecca's articles were remarkable, not only for their meticulous research, but for their focus on the victims as real people with dreams and aspirations, not just statistics in a criminal record. She uncovered details about Elelenena's life before she arrived in Asheville, how she had worked as a seamstress in Richmond, how she loved reading poetry by candlelight, how she dreamed of having her own family after years of caring for elderly relatives. Rebecca humanized Eleanor and the other women in a way that legal documents never could. Rebecca's research also revealed something disturbing that the original investigators hadn't fully grasped. The scheme had likely been operating for much longer than previously thought. She found references in old Charleston and Savannah newspapers to similar disappearances dating back to 1847, almost a decade before Eleanina's case. Women responding to marriage ads, traveling to meet grooms in the mountains, and simply vanishing. At the time, these cases were treated as isolated incidents, women who supposedly changed their minds or left for other destinations. If these connections were correct, the number of victims could be significantly higher than the 8 women identified during the original investigation. Rebecca estimated based on patterns and timelines that there could have been 15 or even 20 women over 11 years. The scale of the criminal operation was frightening, suggesting a level of organization and protection that allowed it to continue for so long. Rebecca's articles generated heated debates about necessary reforms to civil and marriage registration systems. Activists began pushing for laws requiring waiting periods between announcements of intent to marry and actual ceremonies, allowing for background checks. Some states began implementing centralized registries that were more difficult to manipulate or make disappear. In 1893, the National Woman Suffrage Association used the case as an example of the vulnerabilities faced by women in societies where they had limited legal rights. Once married, women of the time automatically lost control over their property, which legally passed to their husbands. This legal system had facilitated Pritchard's scheme, making fraudulent transfers easier to execute and harder to contest. Meanwhile, in Asheville, the story was beginning to take on supernatural elements in the popular imagination. Older residents told younger ones about sightings of a female figure dressed in blue walking along the trails near Crow Point on foggy nights. Some claimed to hear female voices carried by the wind as the fog descended on the mountains, calling for help that would never come. These stories, though clearly embellished by superstition and time, reflected something deeper. The community's collective awareness that a terrible injustice had occurred there, and that it was never fully resolved. The fact that the women's bodies were never definitively found or identified left an open wound in the local historical memory. In 1901, during the construction of a new railroad crossing the mountains near Asheville, workers made a disturbing discovery in a remote area about 8 kilometers northeast of the old Crow Point. While excavating to establish the foundation for a bridge, they found buried objects that appeared to be remnants of old personal belongings, fragments of mirrors, pieces of hairbrushes, more metal buttons, and fabrics partially preserved by the specific composition of the soil in that area. The engineer in charge of the project, a methodical man named Douglas Farweather, recognized the potential historical significance of the discovery. He temporarily halted work and contacted local authorities. A retired investigator who had worked with Wade in his later years examined the objects and confirmed that they were consistent with the period and type of items the missing women would have possessed. This discovery suggested that perhaps Echo Gorge wasn't the only location used by the criminals, or that Wade had received partially incorrect information in the anonymous letter. The Appalachians are vast and full of remote places where secrets could be hidden forever. Each new discovery only underscored the scale of the operation and the impossibility of fully recovering the truth. The area where the objects were discovered was marked, but railroad construction went on unauthorized maps that have a unique annotation. Recognizing that the site held memories of past tragedies, locals erected another small memorial akin to Wade's when that section of the railroad was decommissioned in 1947, decades later. Historians started looking into the case more thoroughly at the turn of the 20th century, placing it in the context of larger trends in exploitation and crime. A professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill released a book in the 19th century, Crimes of Opportunity on the Mountain Frontiers, a thorough study published in 1912, devoted a whole chapter to the missing bride plot. According to the study, these kinds of cases were more frequent than official records indicated, particularly in rural areas with weak civil records and little law enforcement. The period's population mobility, geographic isolation, and slow communication between jurisdictions made it possible for criminals to operate with a degree of impunity, long stretches of time. In particular, Ellelanina Whitmore became a symbol in this larger historical framework. Her tale served as a metaphor for the thousands of women who, while traveling alone in search of better opportunities during the 19th century, found that the world was more perilous than they had anticipated. In a time of swift social change, she was both universal in her portrayal of female vulnerability and specific in her personal details. Asheville was considerably bigger and more contemporary in 1925 than it was in. Around the 70th anniversary of the events, Ellelanina's Time hosted a formal memorial service. A memorial plaque was unveiled at the county courthouse by city officials, Wade and Deputy Blackwood's descendants, and representatives of women's organizations. The inscription honored those who worked tirelessly to bring those responsible to justice, even if only partially, and acknowledged the victims of the criminal scheme. Newspapers in the area covered the ceremony. Additionally, for the first, the case made headlines for the first time in decades. It was suggested that the phenomenon was even more common than previously recorded, when readers wrote letters to share family stories of relatives who had vanished under similar circumstances in other parts of the South. Some of these letters included important details that would help contemporary historians map out the criminal networks that were active at the time. The local historical society's meticulous preservation of the remaining archives included the Ellelanina's Journal, the papers discovered in the metal box, the pictures of the cabin and the underground chamber, and the correspondence between Wade and other investigators are all tangible proof of the case. These objects were turned into teaching tools for criminal history, women's rights, and the development of American legal systems. The case of Ellelanina Whitmore and the Appalachian missing brides continued to captivate new generations of scholars as the 20th century went on. Every 10 years brought various viewpoints, more advanced research techniques, and updated historical contexts that brought to light hitherto unknown facets of that ancient tragedy. Unsolved historical crimes of the American South were the focus of an academic symposium held at Duke University in 1956, precisely 100 years after Ellelanina's disappearance. With historians, criminologists, and sociologists providing analyses from various perspectives, the case of the Appalachian bride was presented as the main focus of the study. Among the most, Helena Marsh, a doctoral candidate who had spent 3 years solely studying this case, presented some noteworthy papers. By applying psychological analysis to the profiles of the involved criminals, Helena introduced a novel approach. She studied trial testimony, the letters Thomas Hartwell wrote to Wade, and the writings of Harlan Pritchard while he was incarcerated. She came to the conclusion that the plan was driven by a perversion of power and control, in addition to financial greed. The men. She maintained that those involved were drawn to them not just by financial gain, but also by their total control over weaker people's lives. This psychological viewpoint helped to clarify why the plan was so effective for such a long time. It was more than just a crime of opportunity. It was an operation that drew certain types of people who could compartmentalize morality, view others as resources to be used, and collaborate covertly while upholding respectable social norms. Looks. Helena discovered something unexpected while researching her doctorate in the Library of Congress archives in Washington. She discovered correspondence between local postmasters discussing worries about fraudulent marriage schemes using the postal system among records pertaining to postal reforms in the 19th century. The Appalachian region was specifically mentioned in a letter dated 1855, and there are numerous reports of women sending letters to addresses that later turned out to be untrue or deserted. This finding implied that although federal authorities lacked the resources and clear jurisdiction to adequately investigate crimes that crossed state lines, they were at least partially aware of the issue prior to Elelonina's case becoming public. Sophisticated criminals like Pritchard expertly took advantage of the legal system's inability to handle interstate organized crime at the time. Martin Vickers, an independent documentary filmmaker from Knoxville, used meticulous dramatizations and interviews with local historians to create a short film about the case. After being screened at local festivals, the movie, Echoes from the Mountains, was eventually purchased by an educational broadcaster and screened multiple times in the 1970s. It was the first time that many Americans, particularly those living in more urban areas, had heard of this troubling period in Appalachian history. A fresh wave of public interest was sparked by Vickers' documentary. Students at universities started selecting the case as a research paper topic. Books about Elelonina and the events surrounding her disappearance were discussed in book clubs. With the growth of the Internet in the 1990s, online genealogy groups started tracking potential descendants of the victims' families, building family trees, and tying together previously disparate family histories. In 1997, Patricia Whitmore, one of these genealogical researchers, learned that she was the great-great-granddaughter of a distant cousin of Elelonina. After learning of her ancestral relative's fate, she was profoundly affected and made the decision to travel to Asheville to see the locations associated with the tale. Patricia went to the location of Martha Kenley's former boarding house, the courthouse where the trial had been held, and finally hiked the trails to the old Raven's Point. The forest had long since reclaimed the original cabin, making it completely disappear. However, Patricia discovered the location indicated on a historical map that the local historical community. She felt a strong connection to Elelonina, a woman who had passed away more than 140 years ago, but whose story continued to reverberate through the generations, as she stood among the old trees amid the far-off crows. In 2003, Patricia's memoir, Searching for Elelonina, A Journey Through Time and Tragedy, was released. The book blended historical research, family history, and introspection about how tragedies from the past still shape family identities today. She committed herself to a portion of the book's sales to support the creation of a scholarship at the University of North Carolina for female students majoring in criminal justice or history, with a particular focus on unresolved historical cases involving female victims. In 2006, new possibilities for the old case were finally made possible by modern forensic technology. A scientific expedition was suggested by a forensic anthropologist from the University of Tennessee to investigate Echo Gorge and other locations that were recognized as possible sites of interest. Using radar that penetrates the ground, the group mapped subsurface anomalies that might point to past soil disturbances using various non-invasive technologies. Although the expedition discovered a number of interesting locations, the topography had been significantly changed by 150 years of natural processes such as erosion, root growth, and small landslides. Tests of the soil showed some chemical irregularities that were consistent with the decomposition of ancient organic matter, but not enough to prove that human remains were present. Despite its impressiveness, the technology's application was limited to such old mysteries. Around the same time, a fascinating finding about the prison system was made by an archivist working in Tennessee state records. he discovered a collection of letters Samuel Crow wrote between 1868 and 1870, during the last years of his incarceration. These letters, which were written to a prison chaplain, included thoughts on regret, guilt, and the burden of secrets he carried. Crow mysteriously wrote in a particular letter dated March 1869, "The mountains guard what has been taken, and only they. I see their faces every night, those women who believed in promises written on paper but devoid of truth. We were tools of something bigger than ourselves, an evil that fed on hope turned to despair. I am aware of the whole truth. None of the individuals involved had ever written anything that came close to a direct admission of guilt. They verified the investigators' long-held suspicions, but they did not offer precise information regarding the fates of specific individuals. The women had met dreadful endings, and this knowledge was a lifelong psychological burden for the men in charge. A permanent memorial honoring Elena Whitmore and all the victims of unsolved historical crimes in the Appalachian region was established in 2015 by the city of Asheville, which is now a bustling tourist and cultural destination. Stone benches are placed in a semicircle around a central fountain in the memorial's serene plaza. The names of the victims of the scheme, including Elena, are inscribed on bronze plaques. Through historical research, Abigail, Lydia, and 5 other women were identified, in order to symbolize all the victims whose names have been lost to time, whose stories were never fully told, and whose absence left voids that no one could fill. An 8th plaque is purposefully left blank. The memorial's main inscription simply states, "They journeyed with hope. We remember them with reverence. Their stories teach us vigilance, compassion, and justice." Both locals and tourists now use the memorial as a space for introspection. Similar. As part of their lessons on local history and civil rights, school groups went. Ceremonies are held there by organizations that assist victims of contemporary human trafficking, highlighting the distinctions between historical and contemporary exploitation, and serving as a reminder that female vulnerability is still a reality that requires ongoing attention. Even after so many decades, the mystery surrounding Elena Whitmore and the Appalachian missing brides will never be completely resolved. North Carolina's mountains protect their secrets with a persistence that surpasses human perseverance, time, and technology. And maybe this incompleteness is what makes this story so unsettling and unforgettable. Looking back through the dusty years that separate us from that gloomy October, we can attempt to picture Elena getting out of the carriage in Asheville, her heart divided between fear and hope, her clear eyes surveying a city that was entirely unfamiliar to her. Like thousands of other women throughout American history, she was merely a woman looking for a new beginning. However, her personal story would become something much bigger due to the destiny that lay ahead of her. A representation of injustice and vulnerability that would ring true for generations. There are a staggering number of unanswered questions. What actually took place in Raven's Point's subterranean chamber? Before Elena vanished from the face of the earth, what were her final words? Did she ever realize that the romantic promises were just fancy bait and that she had been duped? Was she completely terrified when she realized there was no way out? Or maybe she clung to hope until the very end, thinking it was all a horrible miscommunication that would be cleared up. We'll never be able to know, and we are deeply uneasy about this forced ignorance. A sense that the narrative is still lacking. Even though Pritchard and Crow's conviction served a portion of that justice, the ultimate objective of bringing all the victims back into the spotlight, granting them full recognition, and enabling their families to finally discover tranquility. There were glimmers of sincere regret in Thomas Hartwell's broken confessions and mental breakdown. However, regret does not reverse behavior. Stolen lives are not returned by it. It doesn't cover the gaps in family trees where women's names just end without a proper narrative conclusion, descendants, or an explanation. Whether intentionally or inadvertently, Thomas chose to take the secrets that could have saved many people's lives with him when he passed away. Him to the afterlife. The operation's ruthless and cunning mastermind, Harlan Pritchard, never displayed sincere regret. His words were always carefully crafted to minimize his guilt, to present himself as a victim of circumstances or as an innocent middleman in transactions he claimed not to fully comprehend, even in his writings while incarcerated. He continued to tell this false story until the end of his life. A lie he mostly told himself, possibly the only way he managed to bear the burden of. His decisions. After being released, Samuel Crow disappeared like a ghost emerging from the mist, despite the fact that his letters to the prison chaplain provided the closest thing to the truth. He carried memories of faces and voices that plagued his nights as he strolled freely through America's streets for an undetermined number of years. Did he discover a sense of tranquility? Did he try to hide his past by creating a new life under a false identity? Or did he eventually succumb to the burden of guilt in ways we will never understand? Additionally, Nathaniel Voss, the only one who was never apprehended, is left as an unanswered question in the narrative. He might have lived for decades after the incident, possibly even until the turn of the 20th century, constantly checking his surroundings and shifting cities whenever he thought someone might recognize him. It's also possible that he died too soon for reasons unrelated to the Asheville case. Voss was just one of many criminals throughout history who vanish without a trace. The world has changed significantly since the middle of the 9th century. Women now enjoy protections, financial independence, and legal rights that were unavailable to Elelonena and her peers. Systems for civil registration have grown stronger and harder to tamper with. It is nearly impossible for someone to simply vanish without leaving a digital trace thanks to instantaneous communication made possible by modern technology. Nevertheless, exploitation crimes still occur. They have just been modified to fit new circumstances. Unfortunately, human vulnerability is to be steady over time. Despite the minor human tragedies that have taken place on their slopes, the Appalachian Mountains are timeless and unaffected. New generations of pines and oaks have long since replaced the trees that were present during the events of 1856. Elena's routes have been paved or deserted. Crow Point's cabin has vanished back into the ground. However, the memory endures, preserved in yellow documents, stories passed down through the generations, and stone memorials that designate locations where secrets are. Interred. Seldom do modern tourists discover Asheville's sordid past. They come for the welcoming culture, the historic architecture, the thriving arts scene, and the natural beauty. Unaware that they are stepping on layers of history that contain not only wealth and advancement but also tragedy and gloom, they continue to walk the streets where Elelonena once walked. And maybe that's a good thing. In order to create futures that aren't merely shaped by their most traumatic histories, cities must advance. However, for those who are aware, Elelonena Whitmore and the other missing women are still there in a spectral manner for those who take the time to look past the obvious. They serve as a reminder that every era has its own unique types of evil, exploitation schemes, and victims whose voices are muffled by privilege and power. They prompt us to consider who is at risk right now, who is being taken advantage of, and what modern tales are being suppressed and will only be told decades later, when it is too late to truly change anything. Despite its unfinished outcome, The Pursuit of Justice by Sheriff Wade and Deputy Blackwood teaches us a valuable lesson about human perseverance in the face of hardship. When the leads ran out, witnesses lied, and documents vanished, Wade might have given up. But he persisted, driven by a strong sense of obligation to those who were unable to speak for themselves rather than by fame or recognition. Though it rarely gets the attention it merits, this kind of subdued commitment to justice forms the cornerstone of civilized societies. The victims' families relied on Wade to speak for them because they were geographically dispersed and frequently lacked the means or contacts to look for answers. Many of them were unaware of the true fate of their sisters, daughters, or cousins. They persisted throughout their lives in the hope that their kin might still be alive in some distant place, having just decided not to come back. When hope is never fully realized, it can be both consoling and torturous, neither confirmed nor denied. The records that have survived in historical archives are incomplete and fragmentary. There are no pages. The ink has faded. The paper is degraded. However, what is left is sufficient to piece together the story's broad contours and comprehend the scope of the tragedy and the nature of the plot. Future historians who have access to unimaginable technologies might be able to glean more details from these old records, exposing levels of truth that are now hidden. Moreover, who knows? Perhaps in the far future, while excavating for the foundations of a building or constructing a new road, an unintentional discovery will turn up solid physical proof that definitively ends this chapter. The inevitable advancement of humanity and the unrelenting passage of time may eventually compel the mountains to reveal their secrets. Or maybe they won't, keeping silent forever about things that only the earth saw. What can we infer from tales such as these? That trust is valuable and ought to be, given with caution. Because not everyone behaves in good faith, social protection systems are crucial. That vulnerability is a human condition that anyone can experience in the correct situation. It is not a sign of moral weakness. Even though it is frequently sluggish and insufficient, that justice is always worthwhile. And that memory is important, that sharing tales of historical injustices is not morbid, but rather essential to comprehending the present and creating better futures. In search of love, Nina Whitmore journeyed to Asheville. Safety and a new beginning. After all these years, all she discovered was exploitation, betrayal, and an enigmatic conclusion. In American history, her story is not unique. Rather, it is typical of innumerable others that were never recorded, never looked into, and never remembered. By sharing Eleanor's story, we pay tribute to everyone whose names were forgotten, whose lives were abandoned, and whose voices were silenced forever. Appalachia's missing brides continue to serve as silent witnesses to a time when women had few options and frequently risked everything for what sometimes turned out to be cruel illusions of happiness, when communication was slow and uncertain, and when distance meant true isolation. Even though we now live in different eras, the human spirit is timeless and capable of both immense good and terrible evil. This concludes our exploration of one of the most troubling periods in Appalachian history. A tale of dashed hopes, lives cut short, partial justice, and mysteries that have not been solved. Been able to settle completely. Nina and the other women should not only be remembered as victims, but also as actual people whose lives, loves, and dreams were cruelly cut short by those who prioritized profit over humanity. If this story made you think about justice, vulnerability, or historical memory in any way, you might want to consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in a comment. These kinds of stories must be shared repeatedly, not to exalt tragedy but to make sure that we never. Until the next trip through the shadows of history, forget the lessons the past has to teach us.